My name is Maya. I am 32 years old. I live in a rented studio on the north side of Chicago, and I work as a financial compliance analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm. On paper, my life looks quiet. Stable job. No kids. No scandals. But the truth is, the day my mother-in-law asked me to delete the security footage, my entire marriage collapsed in less than 5 minutes. I married Ethan Carter 4 years ago. He was charming, soft-spoken, and came from what everyone around us called a well-established family. His parents, Richard and Margaret Carter, owned multiple rental properties across the city. They hosted family dinners in houses with polished hardwood floors and framed photos of smiling relatives who looked permanently successful. Compared to them, I was invisible. The girl who married up, the outsider who should feel grateful. I never corrected that assumption. At the time, I was already earning more than Ethan. He worked freelance. Inconsistent income, big dreams. His parents blamed the economy. I blamed nothing. I paid our bills. I handled our taxes. I managed our accounts. Quietly. Margaret liked to remind me, often and without subtlety, that the house we lived in was family property, that I was lucky, that Ethan had grown up surrounded by abundance, that women like me should appreciate stability instead of asking questions. Richard never said much. He preferred silence, the kind that watches. The first time I noticed something was wrong was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no cheating texts. It was a single email notification from my bank, alerting me that a guarantor obligation had been updated. I assumed it was a mistake. I did not even tell Ethan. Then came the dinner. We were seated at Margaret's dining table, the one she loved to show off. Crystal glasses, linen napkins. Richard was discussing a plan to consolidate properties under a new holding company. Ethan nodded along, clearly confused but eager to agree. Margaret smiled at me across the table and said, "Vivian, dear, you work with numbers. This will all be routine paperwork." That was when she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "We will need you to sign again, just like last time." I froze her. "What last time?" I asked. The room went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Margaret laughed. "Too quickly. Oh, you know, for the loans, the refinances. It is all family business." I smiled back. "Calm. Polite." My hands did not shake. But that night, alone in our bedroom, I logged into my financial records and saw the truth laid out in numbers that did not lie. Every major debt tied to the Carter family did not belong to Richard. It did not belong to Ethan. It belonged to me, and they had been counting on my silence. After that night, nothing in my daily life changed on the surface. I still woke up at 6:30. I still drove the same route to my office. I still shared a bed with Ethan, listening to him breathe in his sleep. But something inside me had shifted. I had crossed from ignorance into awareness, and there was no way back. I did not confront anyone. Not Ethan. Not his parents. I did not even ask questions. Instead, I watched. I listened. I let them keep talking, because people always reveal more when they believe you are harmless. Margaret began calling more often. Casual calls, framed as concern. She asked about my workload, my stress levels, my health. Then, always gently, she redirected the conversation to finances, taxes, property values, interest rates. She spoke as if I were a helpful consultant, not a daughter-in-law whose name was quietly anchoring their debts. Richard started forwarding emails to me, bank correspondence, legal notices. He always added a short message at the end. Nothing emotional, just practical. "Please review. Let us know if this looks correct." He never once acknowledged that these documents listed me as guarantor. The silence was deliberate. Ethan noticed nothing. Or worse, he noticed and chose not to see. When I tried to bring up money in the abstract, he grew uncomfortable. He told me I worried too much. He said his parents had handled finances for decades. He said family took care of each other. The phrase became his shield. Family takes care of each other. It was repeated often enough to sound like truth. At one point, I asked him directly if he had ever signed loan paperwork connected to his parents' properties. He frowned, genuinely confused. He said no. He said his father told him it was unnecessary. He trusted them. They knew what they were doing. That was when I understood the structure of it. Richard and Margaret did not need Ethan to understand. They needed him compliant, gentle, dependent, a son who would never question the machinery running behind him. And they needed me invisible. At the next family dinner, Margaret brought out documents after dessert. Thick folders, organized, labeled. She placed them on the table with a practiced smile and said it would be easier to handle everything while we were together. She slid one folder toward me. "You have such a good eye for details, Vivian," she said. "We trust you." Trust, another weapon disguised as praise. I flipped through the pages slowly. Refinancing agreements, lines of credit, corporate shells, everything carefully layered. My name appeared again and again, sometimes typed, sometimes scanned, sometimes half hidden in attachments. I did not react. I asked neutral questions, clarifying questions. Margaret answered eagerly. Richard nodded. Ethan watched us, relieved. This was my role: fixing, managing, absorbing weight so he did not have to. On the drive home, Ethan thanked me. He said it meant a lot that I supported his parents. He said he was lucky to have me. His voice was sincere. That made it worse. That night, I stayed up long after he fell asleep. I accessed every account I had ever touched. I traced timelines. I followed payment histories. Patterns emerged with brutal clarity. Every time a loan came due, money moved from my accounts. Sometimes directly, sometimes through intermediary transfers designed to look like household expenses. It had been happening for years. I remembered moments that suddenly made sense. Margaret insisting I handle taxes jointly. Richard discouraging me from hiring an outside accountant. Ethan suggesting we delay buying our own place. All of it aligned perfectly once I knew where to look. I was not married into wealth. I was married into debt. Debt they did not intend to repay. Debt they intended me to carry quietly, indefinitely, because I was competent, and because I did not complain. The realization did not make me angry at first. It made me cold. Anger comes later, when there is still room for surprise. This was different. This was the kind of clarity that strips emotion away and replaces it with calculation. I did not cry. I did not pace. I opened a spreadsheet and began documenting everything. Dates, amounts, account numbers, signature, emails. By the time the sun came up, I understood exactly how much of their empire rested on my credit. And I understood something else. They believed I would never push back, because they believed I needed them. They were wrong, but I did not intend to correct them yet. I intended to let them keep building, keep smiling, keep planning their next expansion, because the higher they climbed on my back, the harder the fall would be. And for the first time since I married into the Carter family, I slept without dreaming. Once I accepted what was happening, I stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like an analyst. Emotion had no place here. Panic would only expose me. I needed distance, structure, and time. Fortunately, those were things I understood very well. I did not change my behavior. That was the most important part. I continued attending family dinners. I continued answering Margaret's calls. I continued reviewing documents when Richard forwarded them. I nodded. I smiled. I asked questions that made me sound helpful, not suspicious. They relaxed around me. They spoke freely. While they underestimated me, I prepared quietly. The first thing I did was separate myself financially without alerting anyone. I opened a new checking account and a new savings account at a different bank, one the Carters had never used. I redirected a portion of my paycheck into it, just enough to build independence without triggering any noticeable changes in our shared finances. Ethan never checked. He trusted me completely. The second thing I did was schedule a consultation with a lawyer. I did not tell anyone I was meeting her. I took a half day off work and drove to a small office downtown, the kind that did not advertise aggressively and did not waste time on pleasantries. Her name was Laura Bennett. and she specialized in financial liability disputes and marital asset protection. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and asked one question. "Did you ever knowingly agree to become the primary guarantor?" "No," I said. She nodded slowly. "That matters." Over the next several weeks, I met with her twice more. Each meeting peeled back another layer of the structure Richard and Margaret had built. They had used my income stability and clean credit history to shield themselves from risk. They had positioned me as a financial firewall, assuming that my marriage to Ethan would keep me compliant. Laura did not sugarcoat anything. She told me the exposure was real. The debt was legally tied to me. Walking away would require precision, not anger. Documentation would be everything. So I documented. I backed up every email Richard had sent me. I saved voicemail messages. I exported bank statements and payment histories. I pulled credit reports and flagged discrepancies. I created a digital archive that mirrored everything on 2 encrypted drives. One stayed with me. One went to Laura. At home, the atmosphere remained deceptively normal. Ethan talked about future plans. Children, bigger houses, vacations. I listened and said nothing. Every word he spoke about security was built on money he did not know came from me. Sometimes I wondered if he would break when he learned the truth. Other times, I wondered if he already knew and chose comfort over honesty. Margaret began pressing harder. She suggested consolidating assets under a single family trust. She said it would simplify everything. She framed it as protection for Ethan. For me, she brought it up during brunch, during phone calls, during casual conversations that were never actually casual. Each time, I told her I would need to review the details carefully. She laughed and said that was why she liked me. Richard remained quiet, but his emails increased. More urgency. More legal language. He began copying Ethan on certain messages, likely to normalize the process, to make it feel routine. Ethan still did not read them carefully. He assumed I would handle it. Handle it. One afternoon, while Ethan was at work, I accessed the shared filing cabinet in our home office. It had never been locked. Why would it be? I found original mortgage documents, refinancing agreements, handwritten notes. Some were older than my marriage. Others were recent. All of them told the same story. The Carter family was drowning. They had leveraged every property to the limit. They had rolled debt into debt, relying on rising values that never materialized. The margins were thin. One disruption would collapse everything, and I was the disruption they had not accounted for. The turning point came with an email titled "Celebration Dinner." Margaret wrote that they had finalized a major restructuring. A new holding company, a clean slate. She said it deserved celebration. She invited extended family, friends, business associates. It would be held at one of their largest properties, the one they were most proud of. She ended the message with a familiar line. "Vivian, we could not have done this without your help." I read the email twice. Then I forwarded it to Laura. Her reply came less than an hour later. "This is good," she wrote. "Do not decline. Do not warn them. Let them gather." That night, as Ethan slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I felt no satisfaction yet, no thrill, only focus. Everything was aligning faster than I had expected. They believed the house was finally theirs. They believed the risk was behind them. They believed I was still standing quietly where they left me. They were wrong, and soon they would learn exactly how much they had built on my silence. The night of the celebration arrived dressed as success. The house was full. Laughter echoed through rooms that smelled like polished wood and expensive wine. Richard stood near the fireplace, holding court, his voice confident as he spoke about growth and legacy. Margaret moved from group to group, smiling, touching arms, soaking in admiration. Ethan stayed close to me, relaxed, proud, unaware of what was about to happen. I watched them the way an observer watches a controlled experiment. At exactly 7:30, Margaret tapped her glass and announced that dinner would begin shortly. She thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about family, resilience, and how challenges only made them stronger. When she mentioned my name, the room turned toward me. Applause followed. Polite, varam, misplaced. I smiled and nodded. Dinner passed without incident. Courses arrived and disappeared. Wine flowed. Conversations grew louder. By the time dessert was cleared, Richard stood again, this time holding a folder. He announced that the family would be making a formal declaration about the future of their properties. He gestured for silence. That was my cue. I stood up calmly and placed my napkin on the table. "I think it would be best," I said, my voice steady, "if we clarified a few details before any declarations are made." The room shifted. Margaret frowned slightly, the first crack in her composure. Richard turned toward me. "Vivian, this is not the time." "I disagree," I said. "This is exactly the time." I reached into my bag and removed a single envelope. Inside were copies. Clean, organized. I walked to the center of the room and handed the first set to Richard. He looked down. His face changed almost immediately. Margaret stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. Her smile vanished. "What is this?" she demanded. "These," I said, "are the original loan agreements, refinances, and guarantor documents tied to every property currently under the Carter holding structure." A murmur rippled through the room. I handed another set to Margaret, then another to Ethan. "I thought you should all see who is actually responsible for the debt you are celebrating tonight." Ethan flipped through the pages, confusion giving way to disbelief. "Vivian," he said quietly, "why is your name on all of this?" I looked at him for the first time that evening. "Because your parents made sure it was," I said. Margaret laughed sharply. "This is absurd. She is misinterpreting routine paperwork." "Then this should be easy to explain," I replied. I gestured toward the large screen mounted in the living room, the one used for family slideshows and holiday photos. Earlier that day, I had connected my drive. The screen lit up. Emails appeared, time-stamped, read aloud by the silence in the room. Margaret requesting signatures. Richard forwarding legal notices. Conversations discussing risk transfer. Phrases like, "Vivian will handle it and she will not object," displayed clearly. Margaret stepped back as if struck. "This is private," she said. "So is fraud," I answered. The room went completely silent. I continued. "Every major liability attached to this family was shifted onto me without my informed consent. My income, my credit, my legal exposure. You built this structure knowing I would protect your son and stay quiet." Richard finally spoke. His voice was low. "You are overreacting." "No," I said. "I am terminating my involvement." I turned toward the door. That was when Laura Bennett entered the room, accompanied by two representatives from the lending institution that financed the Carter properties. Introductions were made quickly. Professionally, Laura addressed the room. "As of this afternoon, my client has formally withdrawn as guarantor on all applicable obligations. Notices have been filed. Accounts have been frozen pending review. Any misrepresentation will be pursued." Margaret collapsed into a chair. Richard argued. He raised his voice. He demanded explanations. The representatives did not engage. They did not need to. Ethan looked at me, devastated. "You knew," he said. "You planned this." "I protected myself," I replied. "There is a difference." Within minutes, conversations erupted. Guests whispered. Phones came out. The illusion shattered in real time. The celebration ended without dessert. By morning, the consequences were public. Properties were flagged. Credit lines suspended. Partners withdrew. The Carter name, once whispered with admiration, became associated with legal uncertainty. Ethan moved out 2 days later. He asked if we could fix things. I told him trust does not survive deception built on convenience. Margaret did not call again. Richard attempted once. I did not answer. I filed for divorce quietly, cleanly. The house returned to silence. Weeks later, I sat alone in my new apartment, reviewing final paperwork. Everything was settled. I was free of their debt, free of their expectations. I did not feel victorious. I felt light. They had believed my silence meant consent. They had believed my competence meant compliance. They had believed I would carry their burden forever. They were wrong. I did not destroy the Carter family. I simply stopped holding them together. I moved on quietly after everything ended. There were no speeches, no public statements, no dramatic exit. I changed my address, closed the last shared account, and returned my wedding ring without a note. The divorce finalized faster than I expected, mostly because there was nothing left to argue over once the truth was documented. Silence, this time, belonged to me. For a while, I waited to feel something grand. Vindication, triumph, satisfaction. None of that came. What I felt instead was space, the kind you do not notice until it exists. Mornings without tension, evenings without pretending, decisions made without consulting people who had already decided for me. Ethan tried to reach out once more. He said he finally understood. He said he had been blind. He asked if we could talk, just to have closure. I told him closure is not a conversation. It is a boundary. He did not argue. That told me everything I needed to know. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard was selling off assets under pressure. That Margaret stopped hosting dinners. That people who once laughed easily in their living room now avoided the subject altogether. None of that brought me pleasure. Consequences do not need witnesses to be real. What stayed with me most was the clarity. I had spent years believing that endurance was loyalty and silence was maturity. I thought that being capable meant being responsible for everyone else's comfort. I was wrong. Capability without consent is exploitation dressed as trust. I learned something else too. Systems built on assumption are fragile. They only function as long as the person carrying the weight agrees to keep carrying it. The moment that person steps aside, everything collapses exactly as it should. I did not lose a family. I lost an illusion. The idea that proximity guarantees respect. The belief that kindness must be proven through sacrifice. Those ideas cost me years. Letting them go gave me my life back. Today, my name stands alone on my accounts, my lease, my decisions. No one calls asking me to fix what they broke. No one forwards documents expecting my signature. The quiet is not empty. It is earned. If there is a lesson in what happened, it is not about revenge or victory. It is simpler than that. Pay attention to who benefits from your silence. Notice who calls you helpful instead of fair. Ask yourself whether the stability you are preserving belongs to you. I did not take anything from the Carter family. I took myself out of the equation. And without my silence holding it together, the structure failed on its own. That was not cruelty. That was accountability. And for the first time in years, I sleep knowing that what I build next will belong entirely to me.